This is a title I've been using around the place, as you'll hear, over recent months. What is a teacher in the 21st century? And what does a 21st century teacher need to know? Since speaking here in September 2014, I've become even more involved in what's going on at Bath Spa, and now delighted to be playing a role in what I call the DITE project, D-I-T-E, Diversity in Teacher Education, which is potentially one of the most important studies on teacher education currently being undertaken in England, but I'll say a bit more about that later. In particular, I want to mention some other keynote lectures that I've given over the past few months, respectively in Oslo in Norway, in Leeds in England, in Chongqing in China, and in Sydney, Australia. That's what retirement's like. Today's lecture is a kind of development from those keynotes. The first two of those talks, in Oslo and Leeds, were given as memorial lectures in honour of two great women in teacher education. 4 or 5 months ago, I gave a lecture at the University of Oslo in memory of this great Norwegian educational researcher and teacher educator, Dr. Helga Eng, who had a profound influence on the development of teacher education in that country. A country which is still leading the way in teacher education in many respects. Her approach started from children. She was deeply interested in how children learn and develop. Most famously, she focused on children's drawings and how they demonstrated their growing understanding of the world around them. That interest in children's drawing was, of course, a key interest for many who believed that education should be child-centred. Although, of course, that term, child-centred, in some European countries at least, has become somewhat discredited, as such approaches have often been stereotyped as being romantic or sentimental. But education that focuses on the learner does not have to be either of those things. Indeed, it's difficult to see how any education that is humane and concerned with individual development can do anything other than start from the learner and his or her attributes, dispositions, and needs. In other words, it all depends on what you mean by child-centred or learner-centred approaches. Helga Eng became known for her commitment to, quote, universal realistic humanism. That was the phrase used to sum up her approach. An important part of that commitment, implied by universal and realistic, is a commitment to communication and to the wider community. This is not just education for the individual, but education through the individual for the benefit of the wider society. In March of this year, I gave the Winifred Mercier lecture at Leeds Beckett University. Winifred Mercier had a very influential career. Wherever she worked, whether at the universities of Cambridge or Oxford, or during her time as assistant principal at Leeds Training College, or then as principal at Whitelands College of Education in London, she was an inspirational teacher and leader. Dogged at many points in her life by ill health, but always driven by her deep religious commitment, she had a profound influence not only on numerous individuals who were in the process of becoming teachers, but also on the curriculum for initial teacher education. And that subject, of course, the curriculum for initial teacher education, continues to be debated to this day. Indeed, it's one of several critical issues in teacher education internationally, and in England we still await with interest the outcomes from the current working group on this very topic, established in the wake of the Carter Review of Teacher Education, or teacher training as the English government insists on calling it. Mercier had a profound commitment to the relationship between intellectual development and practical experience in professional learning for teachers. Although it's not only women educators and teacher educators that have emphasized these themes, it is certainly the case that a commitment to focusing on the learner has been a common characteristic of many of those great women who have made major contributions. I'm thinking also of Maria Montessori in Italy, Susan Isaacs and both Rachel and Margaret Macmillan in England, or more recently Sylvia Ashton Warner in New Zealand, and back to England, Sybil Marshall. These names may not mean something to all of you, but they mean a lot to me because they were among the people whose work inspired me as I was beginning, preparing to be a primary school teacher myself when undertaking the Bachelor of Education course at the College of St. Matthias in Bristol in the early 1970s. Also in England, many of the principals of the colleges of education during the 20th century were women, in addition to Mercia herself. Interestingly, if we look to the USA, so influential in teacher education research at present, 3 of the most important contributors, I'm going to say 4 of the most important contributors are women: Marilyn Cochrane-Smith, Linda Darling-Hammond, and Gloria Ladson-Billings. And of course, I don't need a photograph of Maria Teresa Tato because she's sitting there. The third keynote I have given recently was at an international conference held at Southwestern University in Chongqing, a university which has a wonderful urban campus, which might even be said to rival this rural campus that we're on today. Although the statues are a bit different around the grounds of Chongqing. That's a certain former president, you may recall, one Mao Zedong, whose iconography still features strongly on that very beautiful campus. That conference in Chongqing concerned major themes in teacher education, and the main learning for me, actually on my first visit ever to mainland China, was to start rethinking some of what I say about teacher education in a global context, to take some different issues around scale, economics, and policy making into account. At that university, they're dealing with something like 4,000 teacher education students at a time. Few of them are there in the conference hall. This makes the 200 per annum that we have at Oxford seem like pretty small beer. And when questions came up about how to influence teacher education policy, it's very difficult for someone like me, used to living and working in what we think of, at least, as a multi-party parliamentary democracy, to offer a helpful comment because of the very clear centralized nature of policy making in China. By the way, I'm not wishing to judge one system or another. I may actually end up judging the English system in a few minutes' time, but I'm not making that comparison at the moment. Indeed, the policy process in England is far from straightforward, and although the processes are very different in China, the feeling of constraint and difficulty in influencing policy as a practitioner or as a researcher, as we were saying in the earlier seminar, is very much the same. But then I went on from Chongqing to Sydney, and was reminded of how much change is currently going on in the Australian context, yet another volatile context for teacher educators, where the work of teachers and teacher educators is being reshaped and reorganized in the light of this so-called TMAG report, the Teacher Education Ministerial Advisory Group. And just thinking a bit further on my gender theme about Australia, at a symposium that we held at the American Research Association conference in Washington, an Australian colleague presented a paper about the policy context for teacher education in Australia, and among the slides she presented was a list of influential teacher education researchers there, and of the 6 names on her list, all but 1 is a woman. Teacher education is clearly an academic field where the contribution of women is very much to the fore. These are the 5 themes I want to work through. I'm going to talk a bit about the politicization of teaching, the changing nature of teaching, the importance of research in teaching and teacher education, something about underlying values in teaching, before concluding on some thoughts about enduring themes in teacher education. And my conclusion will concern the nature of 21st century teaching, as I said in the title, and what we should be concerned with teachers in this century knowing. So, the politicization of teaching. However, before we examine the core questions of the talk about knowledge, nature of teaching and teachers' knowledge, let us acknowledge how the wider context, the policy context affecting teachers and their work has changed in the late 20th century and into the 21st. In essence, it is now widely recognized that education has become much more of a political issue than it was formerly. There's a lot of young people in this room. You're going to have to believe me on that one. Education wasn't always as politicized as it now is. Secondly, teaching is at the heart of questions of education quality. The nature of teacher education is therefore very significant. And thirdly, there are global influences on education and teaching throughout the world. That's a bit tautologist, sorry. Both in what we call the developed world and in the developing world. So we're part of a global set of patterns and trends. These, I suggest, are now universally acknowledged truths. But what's the evidence for them? You can start by, for the first one, that education has become more political, just look at any general election. I don't know actually how big education is playing a part in the presidential primaries at the moment, but it'll come through in the actual election, I'm pretty sure. Certainly in British general elections, education has become a very important issue. The point about educational quality and teaching is evidenced by the importance that politicians attach to major transnational reports, such as those produced by the McKinsey Corporation or by the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, TALIS study, Teaching and Learning International Survey. And the third point about global influences is evidenced by the overwhelming influence of transnational comparisons of student achievement, such as those provided by the OECD's PISA, Programme of International Student Assessment, or whatever that stands for. But I guess most of you will have heard of PISA. Sitting in this room as calm and objective analysts of these matters, we may have some deep concerns about the ways in which political ideologies impinge on education. Most of us are either currently or becoming education professionals rather than politicians. We may be concerned about how major corporations that are getting involved in education may have motives that are not entirely altruistic. And we may be concerned about how flawed some of the interpretations of PISA may be. But this is the real world we are living in, and this is the world that children are growing up in, and the world in which new teachers are now being prepared for their careers. Now, the Finnish educator, Pasi Sahlberg, has of course managed to capture a great deal of what's happening around the world in these ways in his term, The Germ, the global education reform movement, which in its epidemiological spread around the world has at least the following 5 characteristics, all of which can be detected in some shape or form in most of the education systems around the world, certainly in the English education system. The standardization in teaching and classrooms, the increased focus on core subjects of the curriculum, noticeably literacy and numeracy, and sometimes science as well. A prescribed curriculum. We didn't always have a prescribed curriculum. Sometimes teachers used to be allowed to make decisions about curriculum. The transfer of managerial and leadership models from the corporate world, and of course high stakes accountability policies, most obviously played out in this country through assessment and Ofsted inspections of schools and indeed of teacher education. Interestingly, Sahlberg, who coined this phrase, notes that these trends have been far less apparent in Finland, his own country, where, of course, there has been consistently successful outcomes in terms of PISA results. So one of the most successful countries in the world in terms of PISA hasn't actually gone down that track particularly. And more recently in Norway, a report of the Ludvigsen Committee into the future of education there was, again, something of a challenge to this direction of travel, having a focus on what they call deep learning and interdisciplinarity, not things you see in that list. The reason that education has become so important in global politics is because of the widely held view that economic progress and development are very dependent on educational progress. In the developing world, this may still be manifested through the prioritization of raising levels of basic literacy and numeracy. In the so-called developed world, however, this focus may be much more on what is often referred to as the knowledge economy, where knowledge itself becomes a new form of capital. Education, therefore, is about developing the technical knowledge and intellectual skills that lead to success in economic competition. So in short, neoliberalism, for that's the best label for these economic, political and social phenomena, has become the dominant ideology across the, whether you call it the Western or Northern world, the developed world, and indeed in many other parts of the world. Even in the formerly communist countries, we see evidence of marketization becoming increasingly prevalent within education and other social provision. But across the world, this neoliberal polity has been the underpinning, actually, to sustain a broadly capitalist economic system driven by markets and by profit, an essential feature of which is differentiation within the population in terms of ownership, wealth, and levels of income. Inequality is an inevitable dimension of neoliberalism, and this inequality continues to be both within nation states, although greatly exaggerated in some states more than others, particularly in the UK, and between nation states, and indeed between economic blocs around the world. My own view, therefore, is that while the visible politics may have changed, and this includes putting education much more centrally into the mix. Why would education come more centrally into the politics of society at the same time as continuing inequality and marketization persist? I raise that as a question. The underlying economic system continues much as it did throughout the 20th century. Significant social inequalities remain, regional conflicts continue, forced and so-called unforced migrations ensue, poverty persists. And of course we do also have a new challenge or relatively new challenge in the form of climate change and the need for environmental sustainability. Now these are all kind of not very positive factors about current society. So what is the role of education? What is the role of the teacher in this world? And as an additional point about the heightening significance of teaching, the point I made about the quality of teaching, we may also observe these concerns have increasingly entered not just the world of schools, but of further and higher education. Most obviously in relation to higher education, with the recent announcements about the teaching excellence framework. Those of you continuing to work in higher education are to be judged on your teaching as well as your research. Perhaps those of us working in teacher education within higher education with over 20 years experience of Ofsted are perhaps less daunted than others by this further managerialist and performative incursion into our professional practice. Furthermore, in the world of further education, and I think you're in further education, I know from reading the chapters in Jim Crawley's book, Jim works here in continuing post-compulsory education. He's got a book coming out in a series that I edit called Critical Guides for Teacher Educators. I know from reading the chapters that he and his colleagues have been writing how much similar tendencies have been influencing practices in the further education system. Second section, the nature of teaching, the changing nature of teaching. Against the backdrop that I have painted of shifting dominant political and educational values, but continuing economic and social challenges, how has the work of teachers changed? As politicians have become increasingly involved in educational policy, we've seen accelerating rates of reform in what Bernstein, the great sociologist of education, described as the three message systems of education. He said you could basically summarize any education system by looking at these three features: curriculum, assessment, and pedagogy. And change has accelerated in all three of those in a country like England or in many other Western countries. Given this pace of change, it's perhaps not surprising that in this country at least, there's currently great concern about recruiting and retaining teachers in the profession. Just 2 or 3 months ago, in fact on the 6th of March, there were 2 stories in the news which are indicative of some of the current issues in teaching in schools. So this was Nicky Morgan speaking at the Head Teachers Association conference. And I'll just read out the last sentence or two because I can't resist it. On fears that highlighting recruitment issues may put people off becoming a teacher, the Education Secretary said, let's focus on commenting to the outside world on what a great profession teaching is, how rewarding it can be, and what good teachers have the power to do. Thank you, Nikki, and we'll keep the rest of it to ourselves, okay? Don't rock the boat. On the same day, we also, linking back to my gender theme that I introduced before, this was just ahead of International Women's Day, which of course March the 8th, she said the lack of female head teachers is a crippling waste of talent. In answer to questions about why there might be a lack of female head teachers, she said the issue is until you help women to senior positions to become role models, it's a self-perpetuating cycle. That's quite a discredited theory sociologically. She added there's a danger of groupthink. If all the top positions are dominated by men, which is closer to unconscious bias than institutionalized sexism. So, Nikki, is unconscious bias okay? It's just institutionalized sexism we should be doing away with, apparently. Strange ideas. She is the Minister for Equalities as well, remember, so she must know. These stories emanate from England, and it's becoming increasingly clear that England is something of a special case in these matters, and that started to come out when we were having the discussion earlier this afternoon. And that England as an outlier is something that's explored in terms of teacher education within this book that I helped to write that came out at the beginning of the year. England increasingly is something of a special case, even if workload issues and gender imbalances are actually concerns among teachers in many parts of the world. As I have noted before elsewhere, the particular ways in which the political changes that I've been talking about have impacted on teaching and teacher education does seem to vary significantly and relates to the relationships that exist within civil society between professionals and politicians, as well as with the wider community and the mass media. Now, often, because of my own experience of working in Scotland and England, I demonstrate this cultural kind of feature by offering a comparison between England and Scotland, 2 parts of the so-called United Kingdom. Just 5 years ago, we saw very different approaches to the reform of teaching and teacher education in these two neighbouring countries. In England, the then Secretary of State, Michael Gove, a politician of course, set out a view of teaching as essentially a craft to be learned in apprenticeship style, or as he put it, on the job from existing teachers. Since then, that white paper in 2010, we have seen increasingly the marginalisation or removal of the university contribution to teacher education in the name of a school-led teacher, or they call it teacher training system. Indeed, a small number of universities, including the one up the road there on top of the hill, have now withdrawn from teacher education altogether. England really has become an outlier in the UK and can be more easily compared with some parts of the USA where similar marketised approaches and fragmentation have been going on. In recent months in England, we've even seen the recognition of the chaos that this system is now experiencing in significant reports from within the establishment. I'm thinking first of the National Audit Office report from February, which included expressions of concern about confusion and complexity in the system. The National Audit Office is worried about value for money, and they're not convinced the government is delivering value for money in its approach to teacher training. But even more recently, last week in fact, the Public Accounts Committee, a parliamentary committee, issued what one particular Dean of Education, who's not in the room at the moment, described as a devastating critique of what has been happening. This is what they wrote, Parliamentary Accounts, the Public Accounts Committee. This is a parliamentary committee offering a very strident critique of how teacher training has been reshaped in this country. The department was unable to provide good evidence that the hundreds of millions of pounds spent on training routes and bursaries, some of which have been in place for a number of years, are resulting in better quality teachers in classrooms. They're not able to provide any evidence that what they've done over the last few years has led to any improvements. So what is to be done in England? We'll come back to that question. But I just want to say a word or two about Scotland, because it's quite different there. More or less at the same time as Michael Gove was making those pronouncements in England about best place to learn to teach is on the job through apprenticeship. In Scotland, the former Chief Inspector of Education there, Graham Donaldson, who of course is a professional educationist rather than a politician, set out a view of teaching in this report, Teaching Scotland's Future, as a complex intellectual activity to be learned through serious study of education and of the teaching of the subject, as well as through practical experience in school settings. He wrote in that report of teachers as reflective, accomplished, and inquiring professionals who have the capacity to engage fully with the complexities of education and to be key actors in shaping and leading educational change. It's a much more active, agentic view of what a teacher is than Gove's idea that all you do is go into classrooms, watch a good teacher and learn how to do it by imitating them, essentially. Donaldson also stressed the important role for universities in teacher education, indeed urged that they should take even greater responsibility. How can it be that two such different views exist in these two advanced nations that are supposed to be part of the same wider political unit, the United Kingdom? Is it simply that one view was expressed by a politician and the other was expressed by a very experienced professional? We can remember that actually, although it was a professional in Scotland who produced that report, it was actually a politician who had commissioned the report in the first place. In other words, there was a political decision behind that report as well. Actually, I would argue that the differences in these publicly stated views of teaching and how they come to be acceptable expressions in each country can only be understood through a wider analysis of social and cultural positioning of public education and of the occupation of teaching in these two nations. In England, teachers have become increasingly the objects of a discourse of derision, to use Stephen Bull's term, in the mass media and through a relentless series of pamphlets from right-wing think tanks, at least since the 1970s. That onslaught had created an extended moral panic within an increasingly competitive world of education, where parents, voters, are made to feel increasingly anxious about school provision. In Scotland, on the other hand, where public education had long been a significant pillar of Scottish distinctiveness, education along with the law and the church, education continued to be highly valued by the wider community as a social good, which was offered fairly to all and provided access to opportunity for improvement. Thus, in Scotland, both schools and universities are more highly regarded and continue to be trusted in a way which has been eroded in England during the late 20th century. It's only those kind of differences that can explain such starkly differing public pronouncements on the nature of teaching, and therefore such widely differing approaches to teacher education that ensue. But if there are stark differences in approach between these two nations, there is one element that they have which is very much in common. That is in the view that a teacher is someone who has responsibility for conveying knowledge to children. Whilst many reviews of teacher education do make reference to things such as technological change, they do not challenge, by and large, the continuing understanding that teachers work in schools where children are brought together in large numbers, and that most of the work of teaching is done in classrooms with teachers taking charge of learning for particular periods of time. That is to say, the fundamentals of the organisation of state education are not being challenged, at least in the context of national reports. So while there may be different views of teaching, the work of the teacher, the basic relationship of the teacher, the school, the class, the children, is not being changed. And those fundamentals have pertained since the late 19th century. Does this mean that current systems are indeed fit for purpose, and that this late 19th century invention, the state school, is indeed the most successful part of what the Anglo-Welsh cultural theorist Raymond Williams described as the long revolution? If we turn to Williams's analysis of the development of state education in Britain, especially England, we can see the continuing influence of the three social forces that he detected influencing that development. These forces were in constant tension with each other, and the evolving education system was a result of the continuously revised settlement between them. These three influences were first the old humanist forces, as he called them, which emphasized the passing on of a body of knowledge drawn from the culture, usually high culture. Secondly, the public educators, who emphasized the importance of education for citizenship, the importance of having a literate and numerate population so that all could contribute to democracy and to development of society. And third, what he called the industrial trainers, who prioritized the economic importance of education in supplying an appropriately prepared workforce to sustain the economy into the future. So if these forces continue to operate today, although perhaps it's the industrial trainers who have been in the ascendancy over recent decades, the economic rationale behind education, how should we expect the challenges of the 21st century to be influencing policy and practice? The endurance of the basic organisational units of schooling, as I referred to a moment ago, is really quite extraordinary given the amount of technological and social change that we have seen. So perhaps the question we should really be asking is, how might we expect the dramatic new challenges of the late 20th and early 21st centuries to impinge on the work of teachers, if apparently they haven't impinged very much? If globalisation is a wider political and economic process that does more to shape the context for education, it is perhaps within the following late 20th and early 21st century themes that we may see more direct impact. Should topics such as these, globalisation itself, multiculturalism or cultural diversity, migration, technology, including the rapid expansion of social media, the environment, or indeed the longer-standing issue of inequality, should topics such as those change the nature of teaching, or indeed the ways in which state education is organised? 5 or 6 years ago, when a team of us at the University of Glasgow undertook a literature review for the Scottish Government as part of the wider review that Donaldson carried out, we identified different conceptions or paradigms of teaching within the policy and research literature. The first of these we called the effective teacher, with an emphasis on skills, curriculum content, performance and measurement. Something that Mr. Gove would have been very happy with. He'd like to have seen all teachers being effective in that way. But the literature takes that model further and suggests that may not be enough. We need to have knowledge as teachers about learners, and we need to consider the values underlying teaching and learning and the purposes of education. But then we can take that further and say, actually, a teacher, to be really professional, should be able to undertake inquiry into all of these processes using research and evaluation methods and techniques. And perhaps the most complex and advanced model of the teacher might be described as the transformative teacher, where it's not just all of the above, but it's saying, I care about the outcomes. I'm going to take a moral position myself. I'm going to ally myself with particular forces in society, members of the community, whatever. What Marilyn Cochrane-Smith calls taking a stance as a teacher. So the reflective teacher may well recognise the challenges posed by the contemporary issues mentioned above, all those globalisation, multiculturalism, technology things. The inquiring teacher may try to see how to improve their teaching in response to those challenges, but it's in the transformative teacher that we may expect to see active responses. For example, think of the role of teachers in ensuring the effective learning of migrant children arriving in their classrooms, to ensure that all children under their responsibility understand the causes of and motivations for migration. Well, that's clearly a curricular matter as well as a pedagogical one. Or ensuring that all children recognise the way in which environmental matters relate to their own communities as well as to the wider world. Do you remember that car exhaust emissions story Volkswagen got caught out on a few months ago? Shouldn't children understand the significance of that kind of thing? As well as making productive use of new technologies, whilst developing critical awareness of their deployment at the same time. All of these would be part of the approach to be taken by a transformative teacher professional working in the 21st century. Third section, the importance of research. When we carried out the review for the Scottish Government of literature on teacher education in 2010, it was apparent that there are some great weaknesses in the field of teacher education research. We have had very few longitudinal or large-scale studies of teacher education in most parts of the world, for what is, as argued earlier, widely seen as a critical aspect of education systems. It's remarkable how little sustained large-scale or international research, and we were hearing about Teresa's work in maths education and teacher education earlier. It's one of the few examples of genuinely international large-scale work. Elsewhere, I have argued for the importance of research being developed in 3 relationships with teacher education. There needs to be research in teacher education, that is, people undertaking teacher education, researching their own and their colleagues' practices. There needs to be research on teacher education, looking at what is happening in particular programs or systems, and there needs to be research about or around teacher education, working out how teacher education relates to other social practices and policies. There was a study carried out in Australia quite recently, well, published quite recently in December, I think it was, called Studying the Effectiveness of Teacher Education, CT. We have a wonderful example of the kind of study that's desperately needed elsewhere. This was longitudinal, following beginning teachers right through the first 2 or 3 years, and it was mixed methods, so it had quantitative and qualitative approaches, and it was independent of government, funded by the Australian Research Council. And this is one of the conclusions from their study. And I do think, in the light of what I said earlier about teacher education in England and how it's become an outlier, our policymakers might do well to observe this conclusion. After this 3 or 4 years of study, they said their findings explicitly support notions that schooling and educating teachers be viewed as a collective responsibility between universities, schools, systems and communities within a newly created real or imagined third space. That idea of the third space has become quite popular in recent times, and the idea that you cannot just look inside one single institution, whether it be a school or a university. You have to create relationships between these different players, and it's in that third, almost invisible or virtual space that the real rich processes take place. But we also need to consider the relationship between the work of teachers themselves and research. In 2012, the British Educational Research Association, BERA, working with the Royal Society for the Arts, set up an inquiry into the relationship between research and teacher education. Admittedly, that was in large part established as a response to what was then happening in England, although BERA, as a UK-wide organisation, considered the situation across the 4 nations. Having gathered evidence across the UK and having commissioned a number of papers that reviewed evidence from around the world, our core finding was that teaching needs to be imbued with an awareness of research. Indeed, we called for all teachers to be research literate. There's the final report. The idea of research literate doesn't mean all teachers should be active researchers all of the time. Rather, it means that they should be able to read, evaluate, and use the research findings that are relevant to their work in order to develop their practice. However, we did also go so far as to suggest that teachers should have the capacity and skills to engage in research themselves, if the context and conditions are appropriate. As for what teachers should know, and therefore the ideas that should shape the education of teachers, we suggested that there are 3 overlapping areas, as shown in this graphic. And the subject and pedagogical knowledge aspects is well established in the history of teacher training, and especially in teacher education. The importance of practical experience in a school setting is well recognised. What we're wanting to add to this was the idea of research literacy, and it's only through a successful coalescence of those 3 areas that you could see the emergence of a teacher as a professional with the capacity to integrate knowledge from different sources and apply and adopt that in different contexts. It's that understanding that led us to draw attention to the concept in teacher education of what has been called research-informed clinical practice. That's the topic of one of the papers that we commissioned. It's an approach that can be found in the Oxford internship scheme, a well-established clinical practice model at the University of Oxford. Also in the west of Scotland, there's a clinical practice model, and a range of developments in Australia, the USA, as well as in Norway and elsewhere. And in terms of teacher research and teachers as research literate, unless I seem over despondent in kind of the analysis of what's been happening in England, we should also note there's currently something of a grassroots movement underway in England and to some extent across the wider UK to bring research literacy into play. I'm thinking of the movement Research Ed, for example. Some of the work currently being supported by the Education Endowment Foundation, which has involved teachers, some of their work, and of a project a team of us at Oxford played a part in, which was led by the National College for Teaching and Leadership, which was seeking to develop research skills amongst teachers. Underlying values. Turning now to the question of values in teacher education for the 21st century. The essence of the argument I've been developing is this. New challenges have been arising over recent decades. These are challenges for governments, for education systems, for schools, and for teachers. That new challenges have not, and seem unlikely to have, a major impact on the organisation of state schooling or on the central role of the teacher. Nevertheless, the challenges do bring new responsibilities for teachers, new challenges for them, and new opportunities. If we continue to see teaching as a profession of moral responsibility that seeks to ensure that every learner is educated in such a way as to make the most of opportunities that suit his or her dispositions, aspirations, and needs, then we do need teachers who are increasingly capable of making difficult judgments in complex situations based on a clear and conscious set of values. Although teachers are usually working in national systems, this does not translate into teachers promoting national values, as actually some English politicians would have it, but rather adopting universal values such as, for example, respect, justice, equity, and the fulfillment of human potential. And in order to inform their judgments, as well as the traditional knowledge of the subject or subjects being taught, and of professional content knowledge and professional skills, teachers need access to skills of systematic inquiry. That is, research skills, as well as access to research published by members of the wider academy. That is what the graphic from the BERA report seeks to illustrate simply. So that kind of reiterates my answer to that question. Finally, enduring themes in teacher education. As we move further into the 21st century, it is crucial that teaching and teacher education continue to be the focus of intensive systematic inquiry, both internally through teacher research and practitioner research, and externally through larger scale research. Large scale projects are extremely important. But thirdly, we also need what might best be called partnership research. That is inquiry that engages practitioners and academic researchers in collaborative communities of inquiry. These three approaches, internal, external, and partnership, which kind of echoes my earlier point about research in, research on, and research about teacher education, and then the enduring themes in teacher education that continue to need to be researched include the relationship between theory and practice, the nature of professional knowledge, the sites of professional learning, where do beginning teachers best learn what, the pedagogical contributions of the school and of the university, curriculum and assessment within teacher education. How do you know when somebody is ready to undertake professional practice in a classroom, and the extended continuum of professional learning, the idea that you don't just learn at the beginning of your career, but you learn throughout it. These are themes that emerge both historically and contemporaneously in any serious consideration of teaching and teacher education. Inspired by the work of a number of great teacher educators and researchers, many of them women, I wish to reassert the importance of research, the importance of learners' experience and development, the importance of teaching and teachers, the importance of teacher education, and following Helga Eng, who some of you didn't hear about, the importance of communication. And to return to my initial questions, in the 21st century, what is a teacher? And what does a 21st century teacher need to know? As I hope I've shared with you, the answers to these two questions are closely connected. My answer would be something like this. A teacher, what is a teacher in the 21st century? A teacher is a person who has made a decision to help to shape the citizens of the future. This is a decision that has a moral component as well as an occupational component. Teachers, therefore, need to have a clear understanding, both individually and collectively, of their own values, of the values which will help to sustain a peaceful, fair, and just future for their students. They need the skills to assess the learning needs of the students for whom they're responsible in the context of a rapidly changing environment, but also to be continually assessing the impact of policy initiatives on their own practice and on the lives of learners. In order to be in a position to make such judgments, they will need research skills of critical inquiry. If this is a teacher for the 21st century, and if teachers can develop such knowledge as part of their professionalism, then not only will they make a continuing crucial contribution to the future of society, they are also likely to be increasingly valued, trusted, and respected by the wider community. And finally, I would submit that all of this is entirely consistent with Winifred Mercier's vision, as she wrote or spoke some 88 years ago. A teacher who cannot or does not wish to go on learning will become a hindrance to the progress of education and a danger to the intellectual development of hundreds of children. In training, she was implying, there must be time to reflect, to assimilate, to apply, time to read with freedom in a good library. We might change that now. We might say good internet access. Time, in fact, to learn how to learn. Thanks very much for listening.